Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. Is morality fixed or flexible? Subjective or objective? That's our topic today. So let's establish what both sides of the debate are. There's one side which preaches something known as moral relativism, which is the idea that morals are subjective, as in they can change from culture to culture or from one time period to another, that there's no such thing as a fixed notion of right and wrong, of ethical and unethical, that it all depends on the vantage point of where you are. So, according to this side, if you, let's say, criticize a foreign culture for being too primitive, or say that a certain practice needs to be abolished, they would say, look, you find that to be moral or unethical simply because you were raised in a culture that considers it to be unacceptable. That if you had been raised in that culture yourself, you would have had no problems with it. This side claims, therefore, that different societies must not be judged based on their practices, that no practice itself is either positive or negative, it's simply a product of that environment. On the other side, you also have people who say, no way, there is an objective morality. There are certain things that can be considered right and wrong, moral and immoral, ethical and unethical, just and unjust. And that simply because something is practiced somewhere else, that doesn't make it acceptable. This is known as moral objectivism. So they would insist that there are things which humanity must follow, and most certainly that there are things that humanity must not follow, even if it's been done for thousands of years. That right and wrong are fixed, concrete notions. Let's examine both sides here. On the side that supports moral relativism, one can see why the idea is so catchy. It represents a win-win situations for both sides in many debates. If I feel that some practice in your country is disgusting and you feel the same way about some practice in mine, this gives us both a way out. We can just tell each other, aha, your practice is fine for your culture and my practice is fine for mine. So it resolves many of these gaps without confrontation. It also manages to provide a counter argument for the typical styles of colonialism we've seen in human history, because every civilization that's practiced expansion and domination has characterized itself as the pinnacle of human morality and the other side as barbaric savages at some point. So the idea of moral relativism can be a great critique of that type of simplistic thinking. It can be a great argument against this ridiculous notion that the conqueror is somehow more moral than the conquered, and that the conquerors not only have a duty to civilize the savages, but that they're doing the savages a favor by conquering them, because they can now bring superior moral values that they spread amongst the subjugated masses. It also answers the question of why morality is so different all over the world. If there really was something that people could say was right and wrong across the board, then morality would be the same all over the world. But it clearly isn't, which some people say is itself evidence that objective morality is a myth. Remember that this doesn't have to be cultural relativism alone, even though I have been giving you cultural examples so far. So let's say something like the phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That's an example of moral relativism as well, where you're equating the two together on a moral scale and you're saying that it all just simply depends on what your own perspective is. On the other side, the moral objectivists say, look at all the practices that were once widespread in many different societies that are considered unacceptable today. Are we going to say that slavery should be accepted just because it's part of another culture? Are we going to adapt gladiator fights again if that's part of a society's historical experience? Would we have made progress in areas like the treatment of women, the criminalization of sexuality, the treatment of animals, and so on, if we had adopted this posture? Their answer would be, of course not. Progress is not made by seeing morality as some kind of case-by-case phenomenon. Progress is achieved by aspiring to a higher, fixed truth. If we were to say, oh well, that's fine if they do it because they've always been doing it, or oh well, it's fine if we do it because we've always been doing it, would any ethical advancement be possible? It would be hard to make that assertion. Also, if we were to say that culture X and culture Y on the same moral pedestal, despite one giving people equal rights while the other practices, let's say, cannibalism? Would that not be sacrificing common sense under the guise of being empathetic and open-minded? So how do we figure out where we stand? Let's end this video by throwing out 3 controversial practices of varying degrees of controversy that we see in the world today. And if you feel that these things are wrong, that they are bad, you are a moral objectivist. If you feel that we shouldn't judge these practices and that the only reason we are uncomfortable with them is because of our own upbringing and our own vantage point, you're obviously a relativist. Example number 1, eating dogs. In China alone, it's estimated that over 10 million dogs are slaughtered every year for their meat. And they say, look, this is how we've always lived. We eat dogs like how you eat chicken and fish. Dogs are beloved and pampered in most other parts of the world. So do you think it's wrong for them to be caged and eaten like that? Example number 2, female genital mutilation. The WHO estimates that about 200 million girls and women today have been forcibly circumcised, mutilated, and that it's practiced in about 30 different countries. What do you think about this? The defenders of this say it's a cultural and religious ritual. Do you find that convincing? And finally, example number 3, let's say age of consent. Different countries have different ages of consent. In Canada, the age of consent, at least for the unrestricted category, is 18, as it is in most Western nations. In Sudan, it's 12, as in a grown man can have intercourse with a 12-year-old girl and it would be legal. Do you feel that this practice should continue if it's what the Sudanese want, and that it's wrong for us to judge this practice? These might be extreme examples, but I think they are valid ones nonetheless, and they really put to test whether we actually feel the way we might sometimes proclaim. Because some people say that there are no real moral relativists in the world, that everybody draws the line somewhere, regardless of how open-minded they claim to be, that everybody has limits somewhere in terms of what they consider to be acceptable and evil. So where do you stand on this? If you like this video, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.